As early voting gets underway in Wisconsin, it shines a light on another barrier facing voters. Sean Gallagher shows us how the voter ID law is disproportionately impacting communities of color.
Local officials say early voting is supposed to eliminate any barriers facing voters who can't get to the polls on the first Tuesday of November. But for many voters, when they go through these doors, they'll face another hurdle: having a valid photo ID.
Struggling with my ID right now, trying to get everything together for my ID.
Antoine Johnson tried getting an ID Tuesday so he can start applying for jobs and be able to vote. But he didn't have the proper paperwork, so he'll have to wait.
It's important. It's the most important. That's why. That's basically. But first and foremost, I'm going to vote. That's what I'm definitely going to get it. I'm struggling, but I'm trying to make it work.
In Wisconsin, voters need one of the following forms of photo ID in order to cast a ballot. But access to a photo ID has proven to disproportionately impact African Americans. Nationally, 95% of white people have a valid photo ID compared to 87% of African Americans. By that measure, in Wisconsin, nearly 32,000 voting-aged African Americans do not have a valid ID, so they won't be able to vote in this election.
Look, in a democracy, you should be working to make sure that everybody can effectively let their voices be heard in an election.
Common Council President Cavalier Johnson says voter ID laws put in place in 2014 unfairly target people in communities like the ones he represents.
It puts a barrier on people who are low income. It puts a barrier on people of color, namely African American and Latino residents in our city. It has been a barrier for years and continues to be a barrier even now.
Low-income households are hit even harder. The American National Election Study shows nearly 1 in 5 people with a household income under $25,000 do not have a valid ID. In Milwaukee, the average household income for African Americans is less than $29,000.
When you put things up like, a photo ID law or other, barriers around voting, that does the exact inverse. It does the exact opposite of what a democracy is supposed to be.
But there are options.
If a voter is struggling with getting a valid ID for voting, we'd strongly recommend they contact us or the Wisconsin Election Commission, and we can walk them through the ID petition process.
If you don't have a valid ID, don't let that stop you from voting. The Department of Transportation does offer photo IDs for the purpose of voting for free. You will need some documents to verify your identity. We'll post those on TMJ4.com. Just click on this story. In Milwaukee, Sean Gallagher, TMJ4 News.